Moving on from the bass drum to the snare drum. Snare drum was a very difficult thing for me to represent in a recording. I experimented a lot with different microphone types and different microphone positions. A couple of things were kind of moments of enlightenment for me regarding the snare drum. The snare drum is a very bright, very loud sound, and it tends to pick up in all of the mics on the drum kit. So you have very limited control over the sound of the snare drum with just the close mic on the snare drum. The close mic on the snare drum is an important part of the sound. It's probably the most important part of the sound in terms of what you can do. But in many cases, the majority of the sound of the snare drum is the sound of the snare drum picking up in the rest of the mics in the room. I tend to try for a sound on the close mic on the snare drum that is satisfying on itself, in itself, knowing full well that that sound is going to be, at least to a certain small degree, overwhelmed by the rest of the microphones in the drum kit. And then I use the close mic sound of the snare drum in the mix balance to provide a sort of a basic standing level of the drum in the mix and adjust the rest of the drum kit relative to the snare drum, with the understanding that all of those other drums, mics coming up is going to affect the sound of the snare drum. So it's important not to get too hung up on the sound of the snare drum through the microphone channel that says snare drum on the track sheet. That is going to provide a substantial amount of the information for the snare drum recording, but it's not going to be 100% of it. Quite often, you will listen to the sound of the snare drum through the isolated snare drum channel and think that it sounds unspectacular, but when you open up the rest of the drum kit, it sounds comfortable and in place, and you don't actually need to worry too much about the sound of the close mic. It's nice when the close mic on the snare drum has a full representation of the sound, but I tend to use it more to add body and definition and attack to the snare drum in a mix, rather than relying 100% on the close mic for the sound of the snare drum. Having said that the mic isn't as important as it can be, I do find that I have preferences, pretty strong preferences in snare drum mics. For the topside microphone, which is what I use exclusively on a lot of recordings, but is a dominant part of the sound, and even if I'm using a bottom microphone, I tend to prefer small diaphragm or medium diaphragm condenser microphones. There is an Altec tube microphone called the 165 or the 175. That's a very nice sounding tube condenser microphone with a small diaphragm capsule. It has very good bass response, which I find really important in snare drum. Especially in a rock setting, the snare drum provides a lot of the power and a lot of the drive in the drum beat. And if the low frequencies aren't well picked up, then the snare drum can sound thin or brittle. Condenser microphones, generally speaking, have a clearer high frequency response than dynamic microphones. So I find that the sound of the snare drum microphone is often quite satisfying without having to use any EQ. If you have to use equalization on the snare drum microphone, you're going to be causing phase rotation in the high frequency and mid frequency components. That is the stuff that interacts with the rest of the drum kit the most. There will also be not insignificant bleed on the snare drum microphone of the hi-hat and the crash cymbal, for example. If you use an equalizer to brighten the snare drum microphone, you're going to be exaggerating and exacerbating any problems with that bleed from the high-frequency stuff that's around the snare drum. In a setting like this, where there is, 8 or 10 inches between the snare drum and the hi-hat, and you can get 6 or 8 inches of distance between the snare drum microphone and the hi-hat microphone, I find that that goes a long way toward minimizing the bleed effect of the hi-hat into the snare drum. There are some physical layouts where some drummers have the hi-hat very close to the snare drum and there isn't a lot of physical space around the drum. And in those cases, you just have to live with the fact that there's going to be a lot of hi-hat bleed on the snare drum mic. Again, the snare drum mic is not the only thing that you're hearing when you're hearing the mix of all the drum mics open, representing the snare drum sound. So it's not the end of the world if the snare drum sound isn't perfect on that mic, but you should try to get it as close as possible to a satisfying sound. For a snare drum of this depth, this is about 5 inches, I don't find that I need to use a bottom side snare drum microphone very often. The bottom side snare drum microphone picks up the snapping of the wires on the bottom head. It also picks up the sort of planar movement of the bottom head, which can add a low frequency component to the snare drum. And I found that for very deep snare drums 6 inches or deeper, or marching snare drums, for example, where there's 12 or 14 inches between the top head and the bottom head, then the snare wires on the bottom are going to be far enough away from this microphone that you're going to lose a lot of the definition of that part of the drum. So you lose a lot of the sort of crispness of the snare wires moving on the head. In a case like that, I will put a bottom side snare drum microphone. For demonstration purposes, I have put a bottom side snare drum microphone on this snare drum, although in practice, a drum of this size, I probably wouldn't use a bottom side snare drum microphone. If the batter side microphone sounds good, but the snares seem underrepresented, then I will put a bottom side microphone on it. But most of the time, for a drum of this size or smaller or more shallow, most of the time I won't need a bottom side snare drum microphone. In this case, I'm using an Octava MK012 microphone. It's a small diaphragm condenser microphone with it has a minus 10 dB pad that you can put in between the capsule and the head amplifier. That's very useful in a rock setting, for example, where the snare drum is going to be hit very hard. Not just because it prevents the head amplifier from overloading, but because downstream from this microphone, there's a recording console. If that console is seeing an input signal level that's super hot, then I'll have to do something on that end to attenuate the signal before I can make it manageable. Like I'll have to put an inline pad, or I'll have to use the internal pad on the mic preamp. And in a lot of cases, those pads can change the sound quality of the microphone. So I prefer to use a pad that was designed with the microphone as a system to bring the signal level down at the microphone if that's possible. Other microphones of this description that have internal pads or that have auxiliary pads that you can use are the AKG 451. There's a Sony microphone called the C37 that has an attenuator pad internal to it, and that microphone sounds great on the snare drum. It's worth experimenting with any microphone of this description to see if you like the sound of it. Shure, now that I think about it, Shure makes a microphone called the KSM 130, I believe, or the KSM 141 is the multi-pattern microphone, and the KSM 130 is the cardioid-only microphone. And the head amplifier for that microphone has a minus 25 dB pad, which is very useful because it brings the signal level of the microphone down to the point where it should be no trouble for any mic preamp that you have. And I think that microphone sounds pretty good on snare drum as well. Okay, the microphone on the bottom of the snare drum is a small diaphragm condenser microphone called the Shure SM98. And that microphone comes with a gooseneck connector and a clamp such that you can mount it to the side or to the beam of a mic stand and then extend the gooseneck underneath the snare drum. I find that very useful because it means that I can keep the clutter around the drum kit to a minimum. I don't need to use another mic stand with another boom on it with another microphone on it. I can just clamp the SM98 to the side of the top microphone mic stand and then use the gooseneck to bring the microphone underneath the snare drum. For positioning for that microphone, I tend to like that microphone pointing directly up at the bottom of the snare drum. I have, on occasion, tried that microphone at an angle, looking across the drum head, but I've found that the planar movement of the bottom head being more perpendicular to that microphone tends to make the low frequencies of the snare drum sound better. If the snare drum is sounding very tubby and you think it has excessive low frequency response, then you could try using that microphone at an angle so it's looking across the head at the movement of the wires on the bottom of the snare drum, rather than looking perpendicularly at the movement of the drum head. But most of the time, I'd say 90% of the time that I'm using a bottom snare microphone, that microphone will be pointed directly up at the bottom of the snare drum. If you don't have an SM98 with a little gooseneck clamp, or if you have an SM98 and you've lost the gooseneck clamp or something like that, there is another way that you can get a microphone in position, and that is to use a strip of gaffer tape to tape that microphone to the basket of the snare stand. so that that microphone is physically mounted to the basket that the snare is resting on, but it's pointed up at the bottom of the snare drum. That's one way of solving that problem. That's nice because, again, you don't need to use another stand. You don't need to clutter up the layout around the drum kit. And in some cases where there's a lot of cymbal stands or there's a rack hardware, for example, it may be difficult to get another stand in there, and that's one way of doing that. The only thing you need to be careful of in that situation is you need to be careful that the part of the basket that moves when the drummer adjusts the basket or removes and swaps the snare drum out, you want to make sure that your microphone isn't impeding any of that movement or isn't going to get trapped and scissored by any of those moving parts. It takes a little forethought, but you can attach the microphone to the stand itself, or you can attach it to the stalk of the snare drum stand. And that's another way that you can get that mic in position. That's useful for larger microphones, like if you have, say, an AKG 451 or another pencil type of microphone. You can sometimes tape that to the stalk of the snare drum stand rather than have another boom coming in that might be slightly precarious. An advantage of that, having the microphone physically mounted in that position, is that if the snare drum stand moves slightly, it's not going to fall out of position on that microphone, and you don't have to worry about that microphone running into the hardware because it's physically attached in place. Again, they're pointed in opposite directions, so you need to normalize the phase of those, and I tend to reverse the phase of the polarity of the bottom microphone. That way I can use it or not use it, and it won't affect the sound of the top microphone. I often find that the bottom side snare drum microphone is picking up a lot of rattling of the snares. Like if the drummer plays the toms, occasionally the toms will excite the snare drum to the point that the bottom side snare mic is picking up a lot of the fizzing or rumbling of the snare wires on the bottom head. To avoid that, I will often use a dynamic control on that bottom side microphone. It's problematic to use a gate on that microphone because other things will make a loud sound in that microphone. Like if I hit the bass drum is very close to that bottom side microphone, and so that bass drum can falsely trigger the gate to open precisely at the point where that fizzling or rattling is going to come through. When I hit the rack tom, for example, that fizzing or that movement of the strainers can open the gate and cause false triggering as well. So what I tend to do is use an expander or a gate on the bottom snare drum microphone, and I use the snare drum top microphone as a key input to that expander or gate. A lot of multifunction dynamics processors like the Valley Dynamite, for example, can be used as an expander, a ducker, a keyed gate, or an inline gate. And I find those very useful in situations like this, where you can switch between the expander function and the gate function and see which one sounds more natural. So in that case, the audio of the bottom side microphone would be going through the gate or the expander. And then you'd use the key input or the ducker input or the voiceover input of that module, and you would send the snare drum top mic signal to that key input, so that as the snare drum top mic sees that the drummer is hitting the snare drum, it'll open the bottom side microphone. But if the drummer is hitting the bass drum or the rack tom or the floor tom, and the only sound getting through the top mic is that distant sound, that's probably not going to be enough to trigger the opening of that gate. So that's one way of cleaning up the sound of the snare drum from the resonant sound of the rest of the drum kit. The snare drum microphone I will often have at a slightly more acute angle rather than the tom-tom microphones. I'm using the side address condenser microphone that allows me to put the microphone very planar to the drums. With the snare drum microphone, I feel like the attack component is more important than the sustaining sound, because the toms tend to ring for a very long time. The snare drum tends to choke itself off very quickly. So I'm not as concerned with the sustaining sound of the snare drum. I'm much more concerned with the clarity and definition of the individual drum strokes. So I tend to have the snare drum microphone slightly elevated over the head, but pointing at the contact point where the stick hits the drum. So just imagining the drummer playing the drums here, this microphone is pointed essentially at the spot where the stick hits the drum. It's not flat across the head for the same reason that I don't put the tom microphones flat across the head. That is, I don't want to exaggerate the edge modes of the drum head. I still feel like the planar movement of the drum head is most important movement, but I cheat the position slightly so that I can pick up the specific stick attacks of the drumsticks on the snare head. From a track management standpoint, I tend not to leave the top and bottom side snare drum microphones separate on the multitrack. I tend to combine them onto a single track, which is labeled snare drum. Gives me a smaller number of things to contend with at mix, makes headphone mixes and things like that a lot simpler. Generally speaking, just makes my life easier if I don't have a bunch of individual tracks which are themselves not useful, but are components of useful sounds. I tend to combine those when I can. If I am using a bottom side snare drum microphone, I will combine it with the top side microphone post-processing, that is after the keyed expander that I described, and mix that with the snare drum in reverse polarity at a balance that sounds good and sounds representative of the acoustic sound of the drum, and then I'll just print that as a single track on the multitrack. As we've been working our way through the drum kit, the multitrack is building up slightly. I might have 2 tracks for the bass drum, or more likely 1 track for the bass drum, and then I would have 1 track for the snare drum. So we would have either used 2 or 3 tracks of the multitrack to get this far into the drum kit.